Red Hollow was the kind of town that had learned to live with fear. It sat out on the dry edge of the frontier, where the wind carried dust across wooden streets and the law often arrived too late to matter. Men there kept their heads down, worked their land, and prayed trouble would pass them by. But on a dry afternoon in late summer, trouble didn't pass through Red Hollow. It stopped. And before the sun dropped behind the hills, the town would witness a moment people would talk about for the rest of their lives. Because on that day, a drunk gunslinger laid his hands on a young farmer, and the wrong man decided to stand up. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The story you are about to hear comes from the kind of frontier history that was passed quietly between old settlers long before it ever appeared in books. A time when towns were built with rough lumber, when a man's name could travel faster than a horse, and when respect could mean the difference between walking home at night or being carried out of town at dawn. Red Hollow had seen violence before. Fights outside the saloon, gunshots in the distance, men who came riding in with trouble written all over their faces, but nothing quite like what happened that afternoon. It started the way many frontier stories did, with a drunk man and a crowd that didn't want to get involved. The gunslinger's name was Cole Braddock. Folks across the territory knew that name, and not in a good way. He was the kind of man who wore his gun low and his temper even lower. Some said he'd already killed more men than he could remember. Others said he simply enjoyed reminding people that he could. By the time Cole rode into Red Hollow that day, the whiskey had already taken hold of him. His steps were uneven, but his confidence hadn't faded. A man like Cole didn't need steady feet to cause trouble. He just needed an audience. And Red Hollow had plenty of people watching. The young farmer he chose that day was named Daniel Harper, 24 years old, tall and strong from years of working dry land that gave back little for the effort put into it. Daniel had grown up just outside town with his mother and younger sister after his father died during a harsh winter when Daniel was barely a boy. Since then, he had taken on the responsibility of keeping their small farm alive. It wasn't an easy life. Every sunrise meant work that lasted until the sky turned orange again. But Daniel carried himself with quiet pride. He wasn't a fighter. He didn't carry a gun the way some young men did out there. He believed a steady hand on a plow meant more than a fast hand on a revolver, and that belief had kept him out of trouble until the afternoon Cole Braddock decided to make him the center of attention. Daniel had come into town to buy seed and a few supplies his mother needed. Nothing unusual about that. Farmers passed through Red Hollow every week for the same reason. But when Daniel stepped out of the general store carrying a sack over his shoulder, Cole Braddock happened to be walking down the middle of the street with a bottle still hanging from his fingers. The collision wasn't even Daniel's fault. Cole staggered sideways and slammed into him, whiskey sloshing over the rim of the bottle. The street went quiet immediately. Everyone in Red Hollow knew what that kind of moment meant. Daniel apologized, clear voice, respectful, just trying to keep the peace. But peace was never what Cole Braddock came looking for. The gunslinger looked Daniel up and down the way a wolf studies something smaller standing in its path. He laughed, loud enough for the whole street to hear, and then he shoved Daniel hard in the chest. The young farmer stumbled backward, nearly dropping the sack of seed. A few people watching shifted their weight, but no one stepped forward. That was the way things worked when a man like Cole Braddock was involved. You didn't step in. You waited for it to end. Cole pushed him again, this time harder. Daniel tried to stand his ground, but the whiskey had filled Cole with the kind of reckless strength that didn't listen to reason. One punch came out of nowhere. Daniel hit the dirt hard, the sack splitting open as seed scattered across the dry street. Dust rose into the air as the young farmer struggled to catch his breath. And Cole Braddock laughed. The kind of laugh that made the crowd look away from the humiliation happening right in front of them. He kicked dirt toward Daniel and said something that caused a few men to shift uncomfortably but still remain silent, because they knew Cole carried a gun, and they knew how quickly he was willing to use it. Daniel tried to push himself up, but Cole grabbed his collar and threw him back down again. That was when something changed. Not loudly, not with shouting or chaos. Just a small movement from the edge of the crowd that almost nobody noticed at first. An old man stepped forward. He had been standing near the hitching posts for most of the afternoon, watching quietly the way older men often did in frontier towns. His hat was worn from years in the sun. His coat carried the dust of long roads. At first glance, he looked like any other aging ranch hand passing through. The kind of man people barely noticed. But as he walked toward Cole and the fallen farmer, something about the way he moved made a few of the older townsmen glance at each other, because there was no fear in his step, no hesitation, just a calm, steady pace across the street. Cole didn't notice him immediately. He was too busy enjoying the attention, dragging Daniel halfway to his feet only to shove him down again as the crowd watched. Then the old man spoke. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried through the street with the kind of weight that made people instinctively listen. "That's enough." The laughter stopped. Cole Braddock slowly turned his head. His eyes found the old man standing just a few steps away. For a moment the gunslinger looked confused, as if he couldn't quite believe someone had chosen to interrupt him. Then his face twisted into a grin. He took another swig from the bottle and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "You looking to join him in the dirt, old-timer?" he asked. The old man didn't answer right away. He simply looked down at Daniel Harper lying in the dust, then back at Cole Braddock. There was something in his eyes that a few people in the crowd recognized immediately. Something cold, something steady, something they hadn't seen in years. Because long before Red Hollow had grown into a town with families and farms, before the general store and the church and the rows of houses along the road, the frontier had been ruled by men with reputations that traveled farther than the law. And one of those names had once belonged to the quiet stranger now standing in the middle of the street. Most people watching that day thought he was just another tired traveler who didn't understand what he was getting involved in. But a few of the older men in the crowd suddenly looked uneasy. One of them whispered something under his breath, a name that hadn't been spoken in Red Hollow for a very long time, because the man standing there, the one Cole Braddock was now laughing at, carried a past buried deep in frontier history. And before the sun set that evening, the most feared gunslinger in the territory would learn exactly why some men were once called the devil of the frontier. The silence that followed felt heavier than the desert heat. Cole Braddock stood in the center of Red Hollow's dusty street, the neck of his whiskey bottle hanging loosely from his hand, while Daniel Harper struggled to steady himself in the dirt. The townsfolk kept their distance, the way people did when danger was only a few steps away. But now their attention had shifted. It was no longer just about the drunk gunslinger humiliating a young farmer. Every pair of eyes had quietly turned toward the old man who had stepped forward. Most people in Red Hollow had never seen him before. His hat sat low, shading a weathered face shaped by years that the frontier had a way of carving into men. His coat was worn thin by wind and sun, the kind of clothing a traveler might wear after crossing half the territory on horseback. Nothing about him looked remarkable at first glance. Yet the calm in the way he stood there felt completely out of place against the tension filling the street. Cole Braddock stared at him with a crooked grin, as if the interruption had simply provided a new form of entertainment. But somewhere in the crowd, a few older men had gone very still. Because in places like the frontier, reputation traveled faster than trains and lasted longer than memory. And sometimes a man could disappear for years only to return when nobody expected it. Red Hollow sat miles from the nearest stronghold of law, surrounded by long stretches of dry plains where outlaws and drifters often moved without consequence. It was the kind of place where stories carried weight, where the name of a dangerous man could change how people walked into a room. In that world, a reputation could kill faster than a bullet. Long before Cole Braddock had begun carving his violent name across the territory, there had been another name spoken with a different kind of fear. Older settlers remembered it clearly. Travelers once spoke about it in quiet tones around campfires, warning young men not to chase trouble where that name might be waiting. Some said the man behind it had ended entire gangs of rustlers during the worst years of frontier violence. Others claimed he had once faced down 3 gunmen alone in a street not unlike the one in Red Hollow. But time had passed, and frontier legends had a way of fading when new outlaws arrived with louder reputations. By the time this story begins, most people believed that man had either died somewhere beyond the mountains or simply vanished into the endless spread of ranchland where old fighters sometimes disappeared. Years had gone by without anyone speaking about him in serious terms. Younger men like Cole Braddock had grown up hearing fragments of the stories, half believing they were exaggerated tales told by aging cowboys who liked to remember the past as bigger than it really was. Cole himself had once laughed about those stories in a saloon somewhere out west, telling anyone who would listen that old legends were nothing more than ghosts of another time. But the frontier had a way of reminding men when they spoke too soon. And on that afternoon in Red Hollow, the reminder was standing quietly in the street just a few steps away from him. The crowd could feel it even if they didn't yet understand it. Something had shifted the moment that old man stepped forward. The drunken arrogance that had filled Cole Braddock's voice only seconds earlier now hung awkwardly in the air as the gunslinger studied him more carefully. The stranger didn't move. He didn't reach for a weapon. He simply stood there looking at Cole the way a man might study a storm rolling in across open land. For Daniel Harper, the young farmer still brushing dust from his hands, the moment felt confusing. He had never seen the old man before. To him, this stranger was just another person who had stepped in when nobody else would. But to a few watching from the edges of the street, the scene unfolding in front of them stirred something buried deep in their memory. One of the older ranchers near the hitching posts leaned slightly toward another and whispered something under his breath. The words were barely audible, but the reaction was immediate. The second man's eyes widened slightly as he looked again at the quiet stranger. Because the shape of the man's shoulders, the calm stillness in his posture, even the way his hand rested near his coat, all of it felt familiar in a way that made the hair on the back of their necks rise. Meanwhile, Cole Braddock took another careless step forward, clearly amused by the situation. He gestured lazily toward Daniel Harper, still recovering in the dust, and spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. The young farmer, he declared, had simply learned a lesson about staying out of the way of men who mattered. His words carried the usual confidence of someone who had spent years intimidating towns like Red Hollow. But there was a difference now. The old man didn't react the way most people did when Cole Braddock began talking like that. He didn't shrink back. He didn't glance nervously at the revolver hanging from Cole's belt. Instead, he held the gunslinger's gaze with the kind of steady patience that rarely appeared in men who feared violence. It was the sort of calm that came only from someone who had faced worse things than drunken bullies in dusty streets. Around them, the town remained frozen, caught between curiosity and dread. Because even though most people still didn't understand exactly who the old stranger might be, the tension hanging in the air made one thing clear. Cole Braddock had crossed a line that afternoon when he laid his hands on Daniel Harper, and the old man standing there now was not just a passing traveler who happened to witness it. The truth was beginning to creep through the crowd like a whisper carried by the wind. Because the man facing Cole Braddock in the middle of Red Hollow Street was not simply another stranger looking for trouble, and the drunken gunslinger, still smiling with careless arrogance, had just made a mistake he didn't yet understand. The kind of mistake that had once ended the careers of men far more dangerous than him, because the quiet figure standing there was something the frontier rarely produced and even more rarely forgot. He wasn't just another old ranch hand wandering through town. He was something far more dangerous. Red Hollow had never been a large town, and the people who lived there understood that survival depended on keeping things simple. A few dusty streets stretched between wooden buildings that had been raised plank by men who believed the frontier could offer them a new beginning. A blacksmith shop stood near the edge of town, its doors usually open from sunrise until the light faded behind the hills. A general store carried the essentials that farmers and ranchers needed to make it through long seasons when the land gave back little for the effort put into it. A church sat quietly at the far end of the road, its white paint worn by years of wind and sun. Horses and wagons moved slowly through town most days, carrying sacks of grain, tools, and supplies to farms scattered miles beyond the last fence line. Life in Red Hollow wasn't easy, but it was steady enough that families had begun to believe the worst days of frontier chaos were behind them. That belief, however, rested on fragile ground. The frontier had a way of reminding towns like Red Hollow that peace rarely lasted forever. It only took one man with the wrong kind of reputation to turn an ordinary afternoon into something people would remember for decades. And that afternoon, the man responsible for that change was Cole Braddock. But before Cole Braddock rode into Red Hollow with whiskey on his breath and trouble in his eyes, there was another man whose story had quietly become part of the town's daily rhythm. His name was Jake Miller. At 23 years old, Jake Miller had already carried more responsibility than many men twice his age. His father had died during a brutal winter when Jake was still a boy, leaving behind a small stretch of farmland and a family that depended on it to survive. From that day forward, Jake became the one who woke before the sun touched the fields and worked until the light faded from the sky. His mother relied on him, and so did his younger sister, who helped however she could but was still too young to shoulder the weight of the farm alone. Jake had learned early that the frontier rewarded patience more than pride. Every harvest required months of effort, and every season carried the risk that drought or bad weather could erase all of it. Yet despite the hardship, people around Red Hollow respected Jake Miller. He kept his word, treated others fairly, and avoided the kind of arguments that often turned violent in frontier towns. Unlike many young men his age, Jake didn't carry a revolver strapped to his side. He believed that strength came from building something that lasted, not from drawing a gun faster than the next man. That belief shaped the way he lived his life. While others bragged about fights in saloons or tales of outlaw encounters, Jake focused on the quiet work of keeping his family's farm alive. Every trip into Red Hollow had a purpose: supplies for planting, tools for repairs, seeds that might grow into the next season's hope. On the afternoon that would eventually become the most talked-about day in the town's history, Jake had come into Red Hollow for the same reason he always did. His wagon waited outside the general store while he carried a sack of seed onto the street. He had no idea that within minutes his name would become part of a story the entire territory would remember. Because not every man who rode into Red Hollow shared Jake Miller's belief in honest work and quiet living. Some men carried reputations that followed them like shadows across the frontier. And among those men, few were spoken about with more caution than Cole Braddock. Cole Braddock had once been just another young rider drifting between cattle trails and mining camps, looking for easy money and the kind of excitement that often ended badly. But over the years, his name began appearing in stories told across saloons and trading posts throughout the territory. Some of those stories involved card games that ended in gunfire. Others described arguments that turned deadly before anyone could stop them. There were even rumors that Cole had once ridden with a group of outlaws responsible for robbing supply wagons moving through the plains. Whether every detail of those stories was true hardly mattered anymore. On the frontier, reputation often carried more power than facts. By the time Cole Braddock began appearing in towns like Red Hollow, most people had already heard enough about him to know they wanted no part of whatever trouble followed him. He was known for his temper as much as his skill with a gun. Whiskey only made both qualities stronger. Men who spent time drinking beside him in dim saloons often noticed how quickly his mood could shift from laughter to violence. It didn't take much to push him toward a fight, and once that line had been crossed, Cole rarely backed down. Some said he enjoyed the fear he created. Others believed he simply didn't care whether people feared him or not. What mattered was that everyone knew what he was capable of. Wanted notices bearing his name had appeared in several towns over the years, though no lawman had ever managed to keep him behind bars for long. Cole Braddock understood something important about the frontier. In places where law arrives slowly, a man with a gun and the willingness to use it could build a reputation that protected him almost as much as it threatened others. That reputation had followed him across dusty roads and open plains until the afternoon he rode into Red Hollow. Witnesses would later remember how the sun hung high above the town when Cole first appeared at the edge of the street. His horse moved slowly, as though even the animal sensed the heavy scent of whiskey clinging to its rider. Cole had spent hours drinking before he ever reached the town limits. By the time he stepped down from the saddle and pushed through the swinging doors of the saloon, his voice already carried the careless confidence that came with too much liquor and too little restraint. Inside the saloon, the usual noise of conversation dipped slightly as people recognized him. Some men quietly finished their drinks and left through the back door. Others remained seated but avoided meeting his eyes. Nobody in Red Hollow wanted to start trouble with a man like Cole Braddock. Yet trouble had a way of finding its own path when Cole began drinking. The bartender served him cautiously, filling his glass again and again while Cole talked louder with each passing minute. Stories of old fights rolled easily off his tongue, mixed with laughter that made the room feel smaller. By the time he finally staggered back into the street with a bottle still in his hand, the sun had begun its slow drop toward the western hills. And that was the moment everything began to change. Because somewhere along that dusty stretch of road, Jake Miller stepped out of the general store carrying the supplies his family needed. Their paths crossed in a way neither of them had planned. The collision was brief, almost meaningless by itself. But for a man like Cole Braddock, already soaked in whiskey and looking for a reason to prove himself in front of a watching town, it was enough. And that afternoon, he was drunk enough to prove exactly the kind of man his reputation claimed him to be. By the time the afternoon had settled over Red Hollow, the saloon had already begun to fill with the slow rhythm of frontier life. Boots scraped across the wooden floor, cards slapped against tables, and men who had spent the day working fields or tending cattle leaned back in their chairs, hoping for a moment of rest before the long ride home. The air carried the smell of dust and whiskey, a familiar mixture in towns that sat far from the reach of strict law. That was the moment Cole Braddock pushed his way through the swinging doors. Conversations dropped just slightly when people recognized him. Some men lowered their voices. Others simply looked away. Cole Braddock had that effect on rooms like this. His reputation arrived ahead of him, settling into the space like an unwanted guest. He walked with the loose, confident stride of someone who had spent years proving he could do as he pleased. The revolver at his side hung low, polished from use, a silent reminder of why people rarely argued with him. The bartender poured him a drink without asking questions. Cole downed it quickly and set the glass back on the counter with a dull thud. Another followed not long after. Then another. As the whiskey began to settle deeper into his system, the gunslinger's voice grew louder. He spoke about places he had been, men he had faced, and fights that had ended with him still standing when others did not. Some of the stories might have been exaggerated, but nobody in that saloon felt inclined to challenge them. Every now and then Cole would laugh loudly at his own words, the sound echoing across the room. He slapped the counter and demanded another drink, leaning heavily against the bar as the bottle continued to empty. The bartender kept pouring, though his eyes occasionally shifted toward the door as if hopping Cole might soon leave. Trouble rarely stayed contained once whiskey took full control of a man like him. After a while, Cole turned away from the bar and began wandering through the room, pausing beside tables where card games were underway. He watched the players with a crooked grin, offering comments that made the men sitting there visibly uncomfortable. Nobody invited him to join their games. Nobody told him to move along either. They simply waited for the moment he would grow bored and take his mood somewhere else. Eventually, he pushed the saloon doors open again and stepped back into the sunlight, the bottle still clutched loosely in his hand. Outside, Red Hollow continued moving through its ordinary afternoon. Wagons creaked along the road, horses stamped near hitching posts, and townsfolk carried on with the kind of quiet routine that helped frontier communities survive. But the moment Cole Braddock appeared in the street, a ripple of unease moved through the people nearby. They had seen enough men like him to recognize when trouble might be close. Cole staggered a little as he crossed the street, taking a slow drink from the bottle before wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. He looked around as though searching for something to occupy his restless mood. For men like Cole Braddock, boredom often led to confrontation. And somewhere in the back of his mind, he seemed to know the town was watching. A few ranch hands leaned against the rail outside the general store, pretending not to notice him. Others stepped into nearby buildings just to avoid being in his path. But Cole's eyes kept moving, scanning the street with growing impatience. He wanted attention, and sooner or later, someone in Red Hollow was going to give it to him. At that same moment, Jake Miller stepped through the door of the general store with a heavy sack of seed resting against his shoulder. His wagon waited nearby, already loaded with other supplies he needed to take back to the farm before nightfall. Jake had spent the past hour speaking with the store owner about prices and weather, the kind of conversation farmers often shared when another planting season was close. He was thinking about how quickly he could return home and finish the day's work when he stepped into the street. That was when the two paths crossed. Cole Braddock was moving down the road in an uneven line when his shoulder slammed into Jake's side. The bottle tilted dangerously in his hand as whiskey sloshed against the rim. Jake stumbled slightly from the sudden impact, but managed to steady himself before the sack slipped from his grip. Instinctively, he spoke the words most men would use in that situation. A quick apology, offered without hostility. But Cole Braddock stopped walking. Slowly, he turned his head and stared at Jake Miller as though trying to decide what to do next. The street went quiet in that strange way frontier towns sometimes did when everyone sensed something unpleasant might happen. Cole studied the young farmer for a moment, his eyes drifting over Jake's simple work clothes and dust-covered boots. Then he laughed. The sound rolled down the street louder than necessary. He took another drink from the bottle before stepping closer. Jake tried to move past him, hoping the moment would end there. Instead, Cole shoved him backward with one rough hand. The sack of seed slipped from Jake's shoulder and thudded against the dirt as he struggled to keep his balance. A few people nearby turned to watch more openly now. Nobody spoke. Cole leaned forward slightly, his grin widening as he looked at the young farmer standing in front of him. Words followed next, sharp and mocking, delivered loudly enough for everyone in the street to hear. Jake Miller tried to remain calm. He explained that he meant no harm, that the collision had been an accident. But Cole Braddock wasn't interested in explanations. The whiskey in his veins had already decided how the situation would unfold. He pushed Jake again, harder this time. The young farmer stumbled backward and nearly fell before catching himself. By now a crowd had begun to form along the edges of the street. Store owners paused in their doorways. Ranch hands leaned against railings. Women walking nearby stopped a short distance away, unsure whether to leave or stay. They all understood what was happening, and they all knew how dangerous it could be to interfere with a man like Cole Braddock. Jake Miller stood there with his hands at his sides, trying to keep his voice steady as he asked Cole to let him go about his business. But the gunslinger only laughed again. He stepped forward and struck Jake across the jaw with a sudden swing that sent the young farmer crashing into the dirt. The impact split the sack of seed open, scattering grain across the dusty road. Jake tried to push himself up, his ears ringing from the blow. Before he could regain his footing, Cole grabbed his collar and hauled him halfway upright only to shove him back down again. Laughter echoed from the gunslinger's throat as he kicked dirt toward the fallen farmer. A few people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably, but still no one stepped forward. They had seen how quickly violence could escalate when a man with a gun felt challenged. Jake wiped blood from his lip and attempted to rise again. Cole struck him once more, sending him back into the dust while the watching crowd held its breath. The humiliation was becoming a spectacle, the kind Cole Braddock seemed to enjoy more with every passing moment. He paced around Jake slowly, taking another drink and tossing insults into the air as though the entire town existed solely for his entertainment. And just when it seemed nobody would stop him, A voice from the crowd spoke. For a moment after the voice spoke, nobody moved. The sound had not been loud, but it carried across the dusty street with a firmness that immediately cut through the laughter that had been echoing from Cole Braddock only seconds earlier. The gunslinger paused in mid-step, the bottle still hanging loosely from his hand as his head slowly turned toward the direction of the voice. Around him, the people of Red Hollow shifted their attention toward the edge of the crowd where the words had come from. Standing there was the old man many of them had barely noticed earlier in the afternoon. He had been near the hitching posts most of the day, watching quietly while townsfolk passed by and wagons rolled through the street. At first glance, he looked no different from dozens of travelers who drifted through frontier towns every month. His coat carried the dust of long roads. His hat had faded under years of sun. His posture seemed relaxed in the way of someone who had spent much of his life on horseback. Yet there was something about the calm in his stance that did not match the tension filling the street. While everyone else had remained frozen by Cole Braddock's reputation, the old man stepped forward as though the situation required nothing more than a simple correction. He moved slowly but with a confidence that felt deliberate, each step measured as he crossed the open space toward Jake Miller lying in the dirt. The crowd parted slightly without being asked, people shifting aside instinctively as he passed. Cole Braddock watched him approach with the crooked grin of someone who believed he was still in complete control of the moment. But the old man's attention never left the young farmer on the ground. He stopped beside Jake Miller, glancing down briefly as if confirming the extent of the damage before lifting his eyes toward the gunslinger standing a few yards away. When he spoke again, his voice remained steady and calm. "That's enough." The words hung in the air longer than anyone expected. It wasn't the kind of threat that usually stopped men like Cole Braddock. There was no raised voice, no dramatic gesture, no attempt to draw a weapon. Yet the tone carried a weight that caused several people in the crowd to exchange uneasy glances. Jake Miller, still catching his breath, looked up in confusion at the stranger who had stepped in front of him. The old man offered him a brief nod before turning fully toward Cole. For the first time since the confrontation began, the gunslinger's laughter faded into silence. He studied the man now standing between him and his victim with a mixture of irritation and amusement. To Cole Braddock, the interruption looked almost ridiculous. A weathered traveler with gray beginning to creep into his beard was now calmly challenging him in the middle of Red Hollow's main street. Cole tilted his head slightly and let out a short chuckle. The bottle in his hand swung lazily at his side as he took another step forward. He seemed to enjoy the idea that someone had finally decided to play the hero. The gunslinger glanced around at the watching crowd as though inviting them to appreciate the situation with him. Then his eyes returned to the old man. His words came out slowly, thick with whiskey and mockery. He asked the stranger if he truly believed it was wise to interrupt something that didn't concern him. The old man did not move. His eyes remained steady on Cole Braddock in a way that felt strangely familiar to a few of the older men watching nearby. Without raising his voice, he answered simply that the young farmer had already taken enough punishment for one afternoon. The calm response only seemed to amuse Cole further. He laughed again, louder this time, shaking his head as if the entire moment had become an unexpected form of entertainment. He took another drink and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand before stepping closer to the old man. The smell of whiskey drifted across the small space between them. Cole leaned forward slightly and said something meant to provoke a reaction, the kind of insult that often started the final stage of a confrontation. But the old man remained still. There was no anger in his expression, no sign of hesitation either. He simply stood there with the patience of someone who had seen similar situations unfold many times before. Finally, he spoke again, this time with a slight edge that caused a few listeners to stiffen where they stood. He told Cole Braddock that he should walk away while he still had the chance. The statement landed quietly, but its meaning was unmistakable. The gunslinger blinked once, as if trying to decide whether he had heard correctly. Then his grin widened again. He spread his arms slightly and looked toward the crowd, clearly enjoying the attention. The idea that anyone in Red Hollow might issue him a warning seemed almost amusing, but something unexpected began to ripple through the people watching. A few whispers started near the back of the gathering. At first they were so quiet that most listeners ignored them. Yet the whispers grew, passing from one person to another like a rumor carried on the wind. One rancher leaned toward the man beside him and muttered a few uncertain words while keeping his eyes fixed on the old stranger. The second man frowned slightly before looking again at the figure standing in the street. The shape of the man's shoulders, the relaxed position of his hands near his coat, the calm stillness in his stance while facing a drunk gunslinger, all of it stirred a memory that refused to stay buried. Somewhere in the crowd another voice spoke softly, almost disbelieving. "Wait, that can't be him." The word spread quickly among the older townsfolk who had lived on the frontier long enough to remember certain stories. Cole Braddock, still focused on mocking the old man in front of him, had not yet noticed the shift happening around him. But the tension in the air had changed in a way that younger men in the crowd didn't fully understand. Near the entrance of the general store stood a man who had once served as a deputy many years earlier, back when Red Hollow had been little more than a cluster of buildings surrounded by open land. Age had slowed his movements, but his memory remained sharp. He had seen more than his share of dangerous men during the rougher days of the frontier. As he studied the old stranger now facing Cole Braddock, recognition began to form slowly behind his eyes. The way the man stood so calmly despite the threat in front of him, the quiet authority in his voice when he had spoken, even the subtle way his coat shifted when the breeze passed across the street. All of it matched stories the former deputy had heard many years earlier when lawmen still traveled long distances chasing outlaw gangs. He stepped forward slightly, squinting as if trying to confirm what his memory was telling him. Images from those earlier days flickered through his mind. Stories of a lone lawman who had once tracked violent men across 3 states without hesitation. Tales of gunfights that ended almost before they began because his opponents realized too late who they were facing. Old wanted posters that had once been pinned to saloon walls bearing the names of outlaws he had brought down one by one. And with those memories came a nickname that had spread across the frontier during its harshest years: the Devil of the Frontier. The former deputy felt a chill run along his spine as the realization settled in. Slowly, almost reluctantly, he spoke the name aloud, just loud enough for the men nearest him to hear. The reaction was immediate. Faces turned toward the old stranger again with new understanding. The whispers that followed carried the weight of long-forgotten stories suddenly returning to life. Meanwhile, in the center of the street, Cole Braddock still believed he was dealing with nothing more than an aging traveler who had stepped into the wrong fight. The gunslinger's arrogance had not yet allowed him to notice how the mood of the entire town had shifted. But the truth was already spreading through Red Hollow streets. The quiet man standing before him was not simply defending Jake Miller from a drunken bully. He was the same man whose reputation had once forced hardened outlaws to reconsider drawing their guns. And in his drunken confidence, Cole Braddock had just done something few men had ever been foolish enough to attempt. He had challenged the man frontier history remembered as the Devil of the Frontier. The whisper moved through the crowd slowly at first, as though the people of Red Hollow were afraid to say the words too loudly. But once the former deputy spoke the name under his breath, the realization began to settle across the faces of those who had lived on the frontier long enough to remember the stories. The quiet man standing in the street beside Jake Miller was no ordinary traveler. Long before Cole Braddock had begun leaving his trail of drunken violence across towns like this, there had been another man whose reputation shaped the way outlaws moved across the Western territories. Years earlier, when the frontier had been even rougher than it was now, lawmen were few and scattered across enormous stretches of land. In those days, gangs of rustlers and bandits rode freely between settlements, robbing supply wagons, raiding ranches, and disappearing into the plains before help could arrive. It was during that dangerous time that one lawman earned a reputation unlike any other. His name had once traveled across 3 states, whispered in saloons, and passed between riders along dusty cattle trails. He had been known for arriving quietly in places where outlaws believed they were untouchable. By the time those men realized who they were dealing with, the situation had already turned against them. That lawman had been the man now standing silently in the street of Red Hollow. In his younger years, he had worn a badge not because he wanted recognition, but because he believed someone had to keep order in a land where chaos often ruled. Stories about him were difficult to separate from legend. Some claimed he had once faced 4 armed rustlers alone in a narrow canyon and walked away while the others did not. Others remembered the winter he tracked a notorious outlaw gang through snow-covered mountains for nearly 2 weeks until he cornered them near a frozen river crossing. The details of those encounters had changed slightly with every retelling, but one fact remained consistent across every version. Whenever this lawman appeared, trouble had a way of ending quickly. The former deputy watching from the edge of the crowd had seen one of those moments with his own eyes many years earlier. Back then, he had been a younger man trying to make a name for himself in law enforcement. He had ridden with a small group of deputies sent to intercept a gang that had been robbing freight wagons along the main trade route. The gang was well armed and confident in its numbers, but before the deputies could even plan their approach, another rider appeared out of the dust. That rider was the man who would later become known across the frontier as the Devil of the Frontier. The nickname had not come from cruelty or reckless violence. Instead, it came from the quiet efficiency with which he handled dangerous men. Those who witnessed his work often said he moved with a calm focus that seemed almost impossible under pressure. Gunfights that might have dragged on for minutes ended in seconds. Outlaws who believed they held the advantage suddenly found themselves outmatched. One by one, gangs that had terrorized settlements across the territory began disappearing. Some members were captured and delivered to distant jails. Others simply vanished after crossing paths with the lawman who refused to let the frontier fall completely into lawlessness. Over time, the stories grew larger. His reputation spread far enough that many criminals avoided entire regions where he was rumored to be operating. Eventually, the nickname followed him everywhere. The Devil of the Frontier. Yet despite the reputation, those who knew him best understood something important about the man behind the name. He never chased violence for its own sake. Every fight he entered had a purpose. Every outlaw he tracked had already caused harm to others. And when the worst gangs had finally been broken apart, the lawman made a decision few people expected. Instead of continuing to build his legend, he walked away from it. Some said the years of bloodshed had grown too heavy on his conscience. Others believed he simply wanted a quieter life after spending so long facing danger. Whatever the true reason, the man who had once terrified outlaw gangs across the frontier disappeared from public view. He left behind the badge, the reputation, and the stories that still circulated in dusty saloons long after he was gone. Most people eventually assumed he had settled somewhere far from the roads where his name carried weight. Some believed he might have died quietly on a remote ranch. As the years passed and new gunslingers like Cole Braddock began carving out their own reputations, the legend of the Devil of the Frontier faded into something that sounded more like myth than history. But the truth had never completely vanished. It had simply been waiting. Standing now in the middle of Red Hollow Street, the man once feared across 3 states looked older, his face marked by years of travel and experience. Yet the calm in his eyes remained unchanged. Cole Braddock, still unaware of the full weight of the moment, shifted impatiently while the whispers continued spreading through the watching crowd. The gunslinger had expected fear when he rode into town that afternoon. Instead, he had found himself standing across from a man whose past carried far more weight than his own reputation. The old lawman glanced briefly toward Jake Miller, who had finally managed to sit upright while brushing dirt from his sleeves. Then his gaze returned to Cole Braddock. For years he had kept his distance from conflicts like this, choosing silence over confrontation whenever possible. But the sight of a drunken bully beating a young farmer in the middle of a helpless crowd had crossed a line he could not ignore. The years may have carried him far from the badge he once wore, Yet the part of him that believed in protecting people who could not protect themselves had never truly disappeared. That belief now stood between Cole Braddock and Jake Miller. And in that moment, it became clear that the quiet man who had walked away from violence years earlier was prepared to face it again if necessary. Because some lines on the frontier were never meant to be crossed. The realization spreading through Red Hollow did not reach Cole Braddock quickly enough to change what was about to happen. The gunslinger stood in the center of the street, with the loose confidence of a man who had spent years believing no one around him had the courage to challenge him. The bottle of whiskey hung from his hand as he stared at the old man standing beside Jake Miller. Around them, the whispers continued to ripple through the crowd. Men who had once heard the old stories now understood exactly who stood in front of Cole Braddock. The devil of the frontier had not disappeared from the world. He had simply stepped back into it when a line had been crossed. The old man's posture remained calm, his hands relaxed at his sides. His eyes fixed steadily on the drunken gunslinger who had turned a quiet afternoon into a confrontation no one would ever forget. Jake Miller slowly pushed himself to his feet behind him, still shaken but no longer alone. The crowd sensed what was coming next long before either man moved. People along the edges of the street began stepping backward without being told, creating a wide space between the two figures facing each other. Wagon wheels creaked as someone quietly pulled a cart further out of the way. A horse tied near the hitching rail stamped its hoof nervously, reacting to the sudden silence that had fallen across the town. Cole Braddock glanced briefly at the shifting crowd and frowned slightly, noticing for the first time that something about the mood had changed. The laughter he had expected from the watching townsfolk had disappeared. In its place stood a tense stillness, the kind that often appeared just before gunfire shattered the air. The gunslinger looked back at the old man again, trying to read the expression that had remained unchanged since the moment he stepped forward. Even through the haze of whiskey clouding his thoughts, Cole could sense that the man facing him carried a confidence different from anything he had encountered earlier that day. But pride and alcohol rarely allowed men like Cole Braddock to walk away once a challenge had begun. He tossed the empty bottle aside, letting it crash against the dirt before slowly spreading his feet across the ground. His hand drifted toward the revolver resting low on his belt. The motion was casual, but every person watching understood its meaning. The old man noticed it as well. He did not move immediately. Instead, he studied Cole Braddock with the quiet patience of someone who had seen hundreds of moments like this unfold across the frontier. Years earlier, outlaws had made the same mistake standing in the same kind of dusty street. They had looked at the weathered man before them and believed age had taken the edge from his speed. But the stories that followed those encounters had traveled far and wide for a reason. Cole shifted his stance again, his boots scraping softly across the ground as he prepared himself. His eyes narrowed, trying to hold steady despite the alcohol running through his veins. The revolver at his side seemed suddenly heavier, as though it understood the importance of the moment before its owner did. Across from him, the old lawman remained still, his coat stirring slightly as the wind carried dust down the empty street. The crowd watched in absolute silence now. No one dared speak. Even Jake Miller held his breath, standing just behind the man who had stepped between him and humiliation only minutes earlier. The tension stretched so tightly that it seemed to slow time itself. Cole Braddock moved first. With the reckless urgency of a man who believed speed alone could win the moment, his hand dropped toward the revolver grip. The motion was fast, but the whiskey in his system betrayed him. His fingers fumbled for a fraction of a second before closing around the weapon. That fraction was all the old man needed. Those who witnessed what happened next would later argue about the exact details for years. Some claimed the old lawman moved before Cole's gun had even cleared the holster. Others insisted the movement was so fast it looked almost effortless. What everyone agreed on was the sound that followed. One sharp gunshot cracked through the still air of Red Hollow. The echo rolled across the wooden buildings before fading into silence again. For a moment, no one moved. Then Cole Braddock's revolver slipped from his hand and struck the dirt beside his boots. The gunslinger staggered backward, his expression frozen in stunned disbelief. The strength seemed to drain from his legs as he collapsed heavily onto the dusty street where Jake Miller had been lying only minutes earlier. The entire confrontation had lasted less than a second. When the dust settled, the most feared gunslinger in Red Hollow lay motionless in the dirt, while the old man who had once been known as the devil of the frontier slowly lowered his revolver. The crowd remained frozen where they stood, their eyes fixed on the scene before them. Some had heard the stories. Some had doubted them. But now every person in Red Hollow had witnessed the truth for themselves. In less than a second, the man who believed he ruled the street had learned exactly why the quiet stranger standing before him had once terrified outlaws across the frontier. For several long seconds after the gunshot echoed across Red Hollow, the town remained completely still. Dust drifted slowly through the quiet street, while the reality of what had just happened settled over the crowd. Cole Braddock, the man who had ridden into town with the confidence of someone who believed fear would protect him, now lay motionless in the dirt where his arrogance had finally carried him too far. The revolver that had once made men step aside for him rested uselessly a few feet away. Around him, the people of Red Hollow stood frozen, their eyes shifting between the fallen gunslinger and the quiet man who had ended the confrontation in less than a second. For many of them, the moment felt unreal. Stories about the devil of the frontier had circulated across the territory for years, but stories often grew larger than the truth as time passed. Yet what they had just witnessed left little room for doubt. The man who had stepped forward to defend Jake Miller was the same lawman whose reputation once forced outlaw gangs to think twice before crossing certain roads. The old man lowered his revolver slowly and returned it to its holster with the same calm focus he had shown from the beginning. There was no celebration in his expression, no pride in the result of the duel that had ended Cole Braddock's reign of intimidation. To him, it was simply the unavoidable end of a moment that should never have begun. After securing the weapon, he turned his attention back toward Jake Miller, who still stood slightly behind him trying to process everything that had happened. The young farmer looked shaken but steady enough to stand on his own. The old man reached out and offered him a firm hand, pulling him fully to his feet and brushing a bit of dust from the sleeve of Jake's shirt. For a brief moment their eyes met, and Jake nodded with quiet gratitude toward the stranger who had stepped in when no one else had. Around them, the townspeople of Red Hollow finally began to move again. Some stepped closer to check on Jake. Others looked down at Cole Braddock with the uneasy realization that the man who had terrified them only minutes earlier no longer held any power over the street. Yet the old man did not linger to accept their attention. He adjusted the brim of his worn hat and glanced once more down the road that led away from town. The wind carried another small cloud of dust across the empty space where the confrontation had taken place. Without another word, the man once known across the frontier as the devil of the frontier began walking slowly toward the edge of Red Hollow. His pace was steady, unhurried, the same quiet confidence that had defined his reputation years earlier still guiding his steps. The crowd parted naturally to allow him through, people watching in silence as he passed. Some of the older settlers nodded respectfully as he moved by, recognizing the weight of the moment they had just witnessed. Jake Miller remained standing near the center of the street, still holding the sack that had split open during the fight. As he watched the old man disappear down the road, he understood that he had just seen something most people only heard about in stories told around campfires and saloon tables. The people of Red Hollow would talk about that afternoon for years. They would remember the moment a drunk gunslinger decided to make an example out of a young farmer, and the quiet stranger who stepped forward to stop him. And they would remember the speed of the gunshot that followed when that stranger was forced to remind the frontier exactly who he was. Because some legends do not vanish when people stop speaking their names. They simply step away from the spotlight, waiting for the rare moment when the world once again needs what they once stood for. The man the frontier had called the devil of the frontier had never chased fame or fear. Yet on that dusty afternoon in Red Hollow, he proved that the old stories had never been exaggerated. They had simply been waiting for the right moment to be remembered again. And in the wild frontier, where justice was often slow to arrive and courage was sometimes in short supply, it occasionally appeared in the form of a man everyone believed was gone. Now imagine for a moment that you had been standing there in Red Hollow that day, watching a young farmer like Jake Miller being humiliated in the middle of the street while the rest of the town looked on. What would you have done? Would you have stepped forward and risked facing a man like Cole Braddock, or would you have remained silent like most of the crowd did until someone else took action? Let us know in the comments below. And if you enjoy stories about the untold legends of the frontier and the moments that shaped life in those dangerous times, make sure you subscribe, because the next story might be even more unbelievable.